Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Pine Tree Pulse podcast by Maine Policy Institute. This is Garrick Hoffman, this is Matt Gagnon, and our guest today is Alan Taylor. Mr. Taylor is a renowned American historian and two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. Originally from Portland and raised in Windham, he is a graduate of Colby College, 1977, and received his doctorate in American history from Brandeis University. Mr. Taylor's Liberty Men and Great Proprietors, seen here, is a seminal study on the post-revolutionary Maine frontier. After a postdoctoral fellowship at the Institute of Early American History and Culture, he taught at Boston University, the University of California at Davis, and the University of Virginia, where he held the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Chair. In 2016, he won membership in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2020 received membership in the American Philosophical Society. Taylor has published 11 books, including William Cooperstown, which won the Bancroft Beveridge and Pulitzer Prizes. The Internal Enemy won the Pulitzer Prize for American History and the Merle Curdy Prize for Social History. He's also featured very prominently in Ken Burns' recent documentary, The American Revolution. Did I miss anything? Does that sound good?
You got all the highlights.
That's a good start. If we do it all, it could probably take a long time.
Yes, we'll fill
right.
up the hour.
Well, we really appreciate you coming on to speak with us today. Really appreciate your time, so thank you, sir.
Well, thank you for having me on.
Yes, of course. So I actually wanted to start this podcast with something that actually Ken Burns said. I don't want to get too focused on the Ken Burns stuff, but he said that the American Revolution is the second most important moment in basically human history besides the birth of Christ.
Right.
That's a pretty bold statement. So I'm wondering if you could expound on that and also, do you agree?
Well, I was involved in many planning meetings with Ken, and I always, in a friendly way, thought, okay, maybe that's just a tad over the top. But he's trying to make the point. It's always a mistake to say this is the most important, because there are a billion Chinese people who may think that some event there is more important. But certainly in the history of the United States, it's hard to argue that the American Revolution is not the most important event. Yeah, you could argue the Civil War is in there as well. But those are the two great generations in terms of creating the situation that we're in the country today.
You know, I think one of the things that's interesting about that statement that Burns made is I have to assume that part of what he was getting at was the effect that it's had worldwide. I mean, the American Revolution obviously was the first step in many subsequent events, the French Revolution, obviously, the rise of democracy and republics across the entire world. And, from that perspective, it is a very, very important event in, frankly, world history, I would say.
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah. So what was unique about it, though? Was it the ideals? And is it because it was really the first time in human history that people essentially weren't subjects any longer?
Well, it's. I would say it's extremely important for three great developments. One that we think about the most is independence. So it's the first time a set of colonies in the Americas declared their independence from a European empire that had founded them and controlled them. Second, it generates Republican government. There's a small R Republican government in that republics were very few, they were very small, they tended to be unstable, and so to attempt this on the geographic scale of the United States is extraordinary. And then the third great development is union, and by union I mean the union of the states. These 13 colonies had not been united before. They were composed of people that disliked each other. People thought of themselves as a New Englander or a Virginian or a New Yorker or a Carolinian. They did not think of themselves as Americans. American at that time, in the 1760s, was kind of a term of abuse. It was used by British people to say that people who lived in the Americas had degenerated from Europeans. So to create a country out of 13 different peoples, to do so by gambling on a Republican form of government, and to fight the most powerful empire in the Atlantic world in order to achieve those goals, those are three enormous gambles.
You mentioned the size You know, and I know we're jumping a little ahead to the post-revolutionary period here a little bit by asking this question, but I wonder how much you attribute the early ability of it to persist and to actually ultimately take hold to the small size of America at the time. I mean, you go back to that period in Boston was the size of, I think, Bangor now. It was a very, very small town, really, by our modern standards. Yeah. And in those kinds of environments, it must have been much easier to actually build a community and actually have some form of self-government in an entity like that as compared to today. Right. You know, it had to kind of naturally grow.
Right. So when I said large, I meant in geographic space. Yeah. You're certainly right in terms of population. So the largest city in the colonies was approximately 32,000 people. It was Philadelphia. So that's about the capacity of Fenway Park. And then the second largest city was either New York or Boston, and they were about 16,000 people each. It's a rural country. People living in small towns in New England. In Virginia, living in rural counties. Towns didn't much matter in Virginia. So it's a world in which people are making their living out of farming. In the northern states, it's mostly free farmers. In Virginia, it's a mix of free farmers and slave owners who are employing enslaved people to do much of the work. But it's an agricultural country everywhere. And it is, as you suggested, more of a face-to-face country. You know your neighbors. You know their reputations. It's a very oral culture in which people tell stories, and they define each other through these stories. There are newspapers, but you don't find them much in the South. You find them in New England and other northern states.
Good. Well, I was just going to follow up on that a little bit, because when you're talking about some of these early experiments with self-government and how they ultimately took hold, I think you also have to go before the revolution to how the colonies themselves were managed, don't you? I mean, you have almost I think a test ground for some of that kind of thing happening because of the remoteness of these colonies. I mean, the communication across the Atlantic Ocean took a significant amount of time. So you almost had to rely on yourself and your community. And a lot of those things that ended up creating the, kind of like the early Republican forms of government were almost built well before in a lot of respects.
I'll halfway agree with you in that communication across the Atlantic is easier than overland transportation within the colonies. It's a world in which people and ideas and goods move most easily by water, so either by the major rivers or across the ocean. So there are ways in which the people who lived in Boston are more connected to London than they are to people who lived in what is now Pittsburgh. But certainly your point about the scale of life and the dispersion within the colonies is important. And you have to have local government for that to work. So the structure of government was very much a decentralized one, except every colony did have a governor. The governor in most colonies was appointed by the Crown. They also had a governing council, which was appointed by the Crown. And the only elected body at the level of the entire colony was the Assembly. So it's not by any means a democracy yet, but there is a democratic element, and it's most democratic in the northern states when you got to the town level. Now, Virginia is different because it's run essentially by these oligarchies of wealthy planters at the county level, and then they are the ones that largely also sit in the House of Burgesses, which is their assembly. So there are different societies in different parts of the colonies.
So you said, you mentioned earlier that a lot of the colonists, they kind of identify it as like whatever their state is that they lived in. If you're a Virginian, then you're a Virginian. But ultimately, they regarded themselves as still British subjects, essentially.
Yes.
Which leads me to the question of, in the documentary, in Ken Burns' documentary, you said that the American Revolution was also a civil war.
Yes.
Can you explain?
Well, not all Americans fight on one side. They're fighting on the two sides. At least a fifth of the people living in the 13 colonies actively assisted the British. Why did they do so? Well, they were the conservatives of the time, and they thought that the revolutionaries were producing chaos, that they were disrupting the constitutional order of things. The Loyalists generally didn't like the British taxes, but by 1774 to 75, they're starting to think of which is the greater problem for us, this kind of disruption that the revolutionaries are bringing, or is it the British taxes? And at that point, they say, we'll pay the taxes if we have to, but we're really upset because there was a lot of mob violence associated with the early stages of the revolution. And a fair number of people were very uncomfortable with that. But again, a minority. The majority of Americans pretty clearly ended up embracing the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny. Actually, I thought one of the more interesting parts of the revolution and that whole era is that Ben Franklin's son, his own son, he was the governor of New Jersey, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
And he was a loyalist, and that's what basically created a rift between them, and they were totally alienated from one another eventually.
They were, and they would not. They only spoke to each other one more time in their lives, and it was a very strained conversation. But that's a prime example of families that got divided and communities got divided. Now, there was less of that division in New England, where it's more overwhelmingly pro-patriot. But if you got into the middle Atlantic colonies, places like New York or Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, then you find a whole lot more division. And you also find that division if you get down into the deeper South, down into North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So there's a lot of killing of people who were neighbors before this war erupted.
What do you attribute, that difference to when you're talking about New England versus some of the Mid-Atlantic and below? I mean, is that because of the nature of, say, like the economies of each region and how they interacted with the British Crown was significantly different, and so the merchants, had a particularly large distaste for, the stamp tax and some of those things that were happening, whereas it was less of an impact in some of these places? Or was it cultural in nature? Was it agitation from, say, Sam Adams' group? I mean, what exactly do you attribute that difference to?
I'd say all of the above. Yeah. So certainly in New England, in a way doesn't fit nicely into the empire, because the empire economically is about moving colonial goods where they're abundant to where they're scarce. So what does New England produce at that time? It produces fish, it produces some grains, cattle, lumber. None of these things are particularly needed except for masts for ships in England. But what does the empire want to import into England? Those are the crops of the South. They're things like indigo and rice from the Carolinas, or tobacco from Virginia, or sugar from the West Indies. And so New England, in many ways, it benefited from being part of the trading orbit of the British Empire, but when the empire's rules restricted that trade, they would trade anyway, and that's known as smuggling. So many of the leaders of the revolution in New England were, as you suggest, merchants who felt that they were pinched by British restrictions on trade. And when they couldn't evade those restrictions anymore, they became more serious about resisting British control. Whereas if you're a farmer in South Carolina or North Carolina, you're not as plugged into the newspapers. You're not familiar with whatever agitation Sam Adams is doing in distant Boston. You're not feeling that aggrieved by the restrictions on commerce that the empire enforced. And so people would make decisions just thinking, why is this disruption coming into my life? I don't welcome it. Just leave me alone. If you won't leave me alone, I'll be a loyalist.
And in some of those early Continental Congresses, before the Declaration was actually obviously ratified, there were those conflicts and arguments. This is basically Massachusetts' war, and they're the ones that are agitating so much of this. And do we really want to be dragged into this?
That's particularly true in the Middle Atlantic region. Now, the thing that makes the revolution work pretty quickly is that Virginians strongly support the New Englanders. And Virginia was the largest colony, largest in territory, largest in population, largest in wealth. So if Virginia was not on board, if Virginia just said, you New Englanders created this problem, tough for you, we're going to go our own way, there would have been no revolution.
So why did they?
Well, they are a place that, even though they're producing a staple of the empire, it's a staple that's especially heavily taxed. There's a really heavy tax on tobacco. And a lot of these planters are deeply in debt because they're importing British goods. They're required, if they're going to import goods from Europe, and they needed goods from Europe, it has to be from Britain. And they have to export their tobacco to Britain, and they have to pay heavy taxes on it. So the Virginians had a sense of grievance that enabled them to partner up with the New Englanders.
I guess as a final follow-up to that, how much did the ideology of some of the people that emerged as leaders in Virginia, particularly in those early Continental Congresses, play into that too? Because you obviously had people that were very much inspired by the Enlightenment, and they had a lot of radical ideas in their heads about self-government and everything that ended up becoming the American experiment. And if those people weren't there, would they have still pushed as hard and animated in that direction that way? Despite that, I mean, how much of it was attributable, I suppose, to those revolutionary ideas in the heads of the leaders in Virginia?
Right. Well, there's a whole range of ideas that they can draw upon. The Enlightenment, which is largely coming out of both Scotland and France, is one strand of them. And we think of Jefferson in particular. He's certainly case number one of somebody who's influenced by Enlightenment ideas. And by Enlightenment ideas, I mean those notions that all traditions should be reviewed, criticized, potentially set aside, and that everything should be reconsidered in a more rational way. So Jefferson's position was that a lot of the structures of government and law had evolved over very long periods of time, and they were no longer relevant to contemporary situations. So he says, let's bring in the ideas of the Enlightenment and say we're going to test everything against that standard of rationality and be open to recreating everything. Now, not every leader of the revolution is on board with that sweeping a set of changes. So somebody like George Washington's considerably more conservative than is Jefferson. Certainly the Enlightenment has some influence on him, but I would say it's more the tradition of the English common law with its notion of the protection of the rights of the individual from the power of the state. It's that kind of tradition that also is influential. And then there are religious ideas. This was a country in which the vast majority of people were Protestants. The one book that they were thoroughly familiar with was the Bible. And so you're not really going to wage a revolution that's going to mobilize a lot of people unless you are able to make the case that in many ways the British are resembling the tyrants of the Old Testament. And so that's what a variety of ministers bring to it. Now, they're not the top leaders of the revolution, but they're very helpful in mobilizing a more mass support for the leaders of the revolution.
So I know that a lot of people were really frustrated with the king during the Stamp Act or after the Stamp Act. And, the king / Parliament really actually was trying to justify the tax by saying, like, we need to recoup our costs after trying to protect you, the colonists, after the 7 Years' War. And, reading about that, I'm like, that actually is like kind of rational. It's reasonable, at least it seems like. It seems justifiable. But then I know that a lot of the colonists thought like, well, we financed a lot of it too. So I'm wondering if you could maybe clear that up or explain it. Like, was it justified, do you think?
Well, you're going to out me as a loyalist here.
Yeah.
Well, in 1765, which is the stamp tax riots, they're not upset at the king, they're upset at Parliament. They made a distinction at that time.
Yes.
So Britain was an interesting country in that the legislature has more authority than it did, say, in France or in Spain, where the legislature hardly met and the king and his court just ran things the way they wanted to. So in fact, the colonists in the 1760s keep appealing to the king, saying, please overrule your parliament. And the king's being conscientious, said, I can't overrule the parliament. We had civil wars when kings tried to overrule the parliament. So the people in Britain were the most heavily taxed people in Europe because Britain has a very large navy, has a pretty significant army. These things are expensive. So the members of Parliament are saying, we can't tax our people any more than they're already taxed. It's just not going to work. And then they said, who really benefited from this recent war? It's the colonists. And the colonists were not paying heavy taxes to the empire. They weren't paying heavy taxes to their colony. They were one of the most lightly taxed people in the world.
Yeah, and they got really, like, relatively prosperous.
And they're prospering. If you're
Yeah.
a free person, you're prospering more than people and common people were in Britain, where it was hard to own your own land. So the British officials, from their position, you're entirely right, it's completely rational. Shouldn't the people who really benefited from this recent war, who are prospering and have such a light tax burden, shouldn't they pay more toward the cost of the empire? That's all reasonable enough. Now, why do the colonists oppose it then? Well, they say this sets a really bad precedent. If a legislature where we don't have any representation has the power to tax us, when will they stop? How high will the taxes be? Will we lose our special circumstances here? Will it become harder to own land if we're under the authority of a legislature where we have no influence? The legislature is on the other side of the Atlantic. There are no colonists in it. The colonists actually didn't want to be in Parliament. What they wanted was only our colonial legislature, where we can elect our representatives, only that legislature should be able to tax us.
Was there any discussion about bringing colonists into Parliament? I mean, was that ever really seriously discussed by anyone in Britain?
Not really. I mean, there were a few people that floated this, but the British weren't keen on it.
Yeah.
They had a prejudice against the colonists as not worthy of participating in Parliament. And then the colonists didn't want to participate in it because they thought, long ways away in terms of if you want to be in touch with your constituents, the turnaround time across the Atlantic for a message is about, at a minimum, 3 months. And we would just be a small element in that legislature. The colonies had a smaller population than was the case in Britain. So for all those reasons, neither the colonists nor the British want to have American members of Parliament.
I think one of the great ironies of the Revolutionary War is the fact that it kind of, well, first of all, the frustration and unrest was fomented after the British was trying to recoup their costs of the 7 Years' War with all these taxes. And then it turns out that the British ended up having to finance a whole nother war for 8 years that they lost.
Yeah, there are all sorts of ironies there. Is that the war is colossally expensive. The war against the colonial rebellion, what we call the American Revolution, much more expensive than the preceding war. So the British national debt is going to explode yet again. So that's a problem. But what it also does is it generates an enormous debt within the United States. The new United States can't wage this war without money. But they did wage it this war without money, so they had to either do two things. One is they printed up a lot of paper, and it set off massive inflation, and it crippled the American economy through the war and into the 1780s. The second thing they did was they borrowed money. A lot of times they're borrowing from their own people, saying, you give me cattle for the army now, we can't pay you. Here's a piece of paper that says we'll pay you in the future. Or they're borrowing from France or from Dutch bankers who helped to finance the American Revolution. So when the war is over, the states have enormous debts, the individual states, and then the United States has an enormous national debt. And how they're going to cope with that is the initial immense challenge of the United States. To survive, it's going to have to do something about that national debt.
You spoke last night at the Maine for the Maine Historical Society. You talked about Joseph Plum Martin, who was a soldier from Connecticut. He fought all the way through the final battle of Yorktown. But I'm actually just curious if you could describe, I guess, the life of the common soldier, what the reality was like for them. Because a lot of people, I think, underestimate just how much they suffered, the kind of adversity that
when you're eating your own boots. I mean,
yes, right, and literally freezing to death.
Yeah.
You know, like in York or in Trenton and everything, or during Benedict Arnold's campaign through Maine. So, can you just describe the life of a soldier?
Sure, it's a pretty hard life, in that the the Continental Army is the core element of the Patriot military cause, and they're soldiers that are enlisted by the middle of the war for at least 3 years, and if not the duration of the war. So there's no going home. They were promised that they would get paid, that they would get decent clothing twice a year, that they would have adequate shelter, that they would have adequate food. None of these things were fulfilled. It's not because Congress didn't want to fulfill them, it's that Congress didn't have the money to do it, and then the whole infrastructure of supporting the Army was so chaotic. And there were elements of corruption, of contractors who were delivering shoddy food, and so forth. Every problem you could imagine about supplying this Army existed. And the people who are bearing the brunt of it are the enlisted men. And by the middle of the war, they're drawn from the poorer part of American society. They include a significant number of people who had been held in slavery, a lot of former indentured servants, recent immigrants, people who had deserted from the British Army, people who were being held in local jails for this or that and were told, well, wouldn't you like to go to the Continental Army? And so the people of some middle-class standing were increasingly reluctant to go into the Army by the middle of the war. And so we have people like Joseph Plum Martin who are bearing the very worst experience of the war. But Martin is arguing in his book, and he wrote the only book-length memoir by a Continental soldier that survives. And he's a very good writer. And he's trying to make the case that it's the endurance of these common soldiers that enabled the war to be won.
Garrick mentioned a moment ago the campaign through Maine. I think this would be an awesome time to maybe take a spin into our neck of the woods and ask the role that Maine played in the Revolution, such as it was, since Maine didn't even exist at the time. I mean, it did, but it was part of Massachusetts.
Yeah, it's
obviously
not a state.
But it's there,
part of Massachusetts,
and there are people living in it.
Yes, there are.
I'm curious about your perspective on that participation that early, because I think it's fairly well known now that as you go through the rest of American history, especially the Civil War and then beyond, Maine has had a particularly high sort of participation rate. A lot of people join up in these causes. They are somewhat militaristic in some ways, which is interesting. Was that true then? I know it was obviously small population, but how did it react to what was going on at the time? And then what did we see happen from the Maine perspective in the Revolution?
So Maine has a relatively small population at the time of the Revolution. It's less than 100,000 people, and they're stretched along the coast. There's not much settlement in the interior, a little bit up the Kennebec River. And so people are very oriented toward the sea. Including the people who are farmers. They're often cutting cordwood or lumber, and that's all being shipped out, and it's usually being shipped out to Boston. So their economic connections are to Boston and to Salem. So as Boston and Salem are becoming radicalized, that's going to have an influence in Maine. Now, what's working against that is if you're a very coastal people, you're vulnerable to naval power. And the Royal Navy is the naval power of the world at that time. So you could compare Maine to Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is a colony that did not join the Revolution. There were some people there who were supporters of the Revolution, but they were a minority. And the Nova Scotians reached the calculation of whatever dissatisfaction we have with British taxes, we can't afford to alienate the British Navy. Whereas people along the coast of Maine overwhelmingly thought, we have to risk alienating the Royal Navy because we are culturally and economically tied to the rest of New England in a way that's more important to us.
So we're actually conducting this interview in Portland, and it was once Falmouth, Massachusetts, and there was a really significant event leading up to the war here.
Yes.
Can you explain it?
Well, in 1775, this is after Lexington and Concord, so after that, New England militiamen had stayed to coop up the British garrison at Boston Boston's under British military occupation, but they can't venture out into the countryside because they're being surrounded by this Patriot force. The British need things like wood to build barracks. They would like to get it out of Maine. That's the easiest place to go and get it. They control the waterways because of the Royal Navy, so they were going up and they're trying to engage in trade with people along the coast of Maine to get wood that they could use in Boston. Also, cordwood, because the great fuel of that time was firewood. It's not coal, it's not oil, it's firewood. And that's coming from the coast of Maine. So Britain is thinking, our money is good, we'll go up there and we'll get it. And they found some people are willing to trade with them, but a lot of people are adhering to the Patriot cause and saying, doesn't matter that we might make some money, we have to support the Patriots, and we got to get the British flushed out of Boston, so we can't be helping them in any way. And that's frustrating to the British, who feel like, why would you be helping a bunch of rebels? You should be helping your king's Navy and Army. And they get sufficiently irritated that they send a boat crew here. The boat crew gets grabbed by the local Patriots, and then the British are really upset. And they decide to make an example out of the town of Falmouth, which is now the town of Portland, by opening fire on it and essentially destroying most of the town. And that's just shocking. That's shocking throughout the rest of the colonies. And the notion that Britain would be willing to unleash this kind of power on fellow British people living in the colonies is shocking.
But it justifies what you were just saying, though, about the fear of the coastal people.
Yes.
Sort of having that awareness of the British Navy being a real threat to them, because
Absolutely.
they obviously were.
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was actually more of a catalyzing event than I think people might really acknowledge. George Washington, he actually said the savage and brutal barbarity of our enemies in burning Falmouth is a full demonstration that there is not the least remains of virtue, wisdom, or humanity in the British court, and that they are fully determined with fire and sword to butcher and destroy, beggar, and enslave the whole American people.
Right. So certainly that's the way it looks. Now, it seems the local admiral who was charged here had authorized the commander who opened fire to do this, indeed encouraged it. It wasn't a directive that came from London, for example, but this goes to the problems that communications back and forth across the Atlantic, people in the military will be doing things, and they're not always clear on whether this is exactly what the home government wants. But certainly it reflects very badly on the home government that it has sent out commanders who are willing to do things like this.
I have an interesting question here, which is, I hope, not too far afield from our conversation, but one of the things I was just thinking of when we were talking about especially Maine's role is how unsettled really a lot of this outcome really would have been at the time. I mean, there's an alternative universe somewhere where the United States ultimately owned Canada because things went differently, and that those relationships that we think of today are not exactly set as they are because of the events that went on at that time. I'm very interested in Maine political history, and the northern border of our state, even when we became a state, wasn't settled until the mid-1800s, which is fascinating in and of itself. Certain areas of Maine today, you don't even really know, was it British Canada? Was it the United States? It's neither. There's a lot of interesting things about that early settlement there. But could you talk briefly about, that angle of the Revolutionary War and whether or not to expand it into Canada and what ultimately happened with it and what could have gone differently if certain things might have been different? Right.
Well, Britain had 27 colonies in North America, but that includes islands in the Caribbean. And so it's only a subset of the colonies that rebel. That subset of the colonies are hoping that they can get the other British colonies to come on board with them. So there's hopes they can bring Nova Scotia in. They could bring in Quebec, which is also known as Canada at the time. And there's also an awareness that it's a security problem for the new United States, that Britain has a military presence in Canada, and they can use it as a platform to attack the northern states of the new United States. So to head that off, they send an invasion force. And Garrick mentioned that one part of that invasion force went up the Kennebec River and the Dead River and across the watershed to the Chaudière River to hit Quebec. Another invasion force went down Lake Champlain, the Richelieu River, to hit Montreal, and then proceeded on to Quebec. And the point of that expedition is to impress the Canadians, think, well, this rebel force actually is formidable enough to potentially win this war, and to bring them on board. It's also to eliminate military bases that the British could use to strike into the colonies. It's an expedition that starts out pretty well. They do capture Montreal. They attack Quebec at the very end of 1775, but they're defeated very badly there. And then British reinforcements come in the spring of 1776, and they roll back this invasion, which turns into a great disaster. And the United States will never be in a position to invade Canada again for the rest of this war.
Yeah, reading about that whole campaign through Maine to me is still truly staggering, and because it's partly because I've paddled the Allagash River a few times with friends, in the 21st century.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine doing that in the wintertime, but I especially can't imagine doing, paddling down the Kennebec in the dead of winter in the 18th century.
Right.
So could you maybe explain what?
Well, it's not the dead of winter, but it is fall, and and by the it's cold enough. So it's not like the river's locked up with ice.
But it did take longer than they expected, right?
Well, on paper it looks nice, but no army had ever moved along that route. They're not really clear. That their maps aren't entirely accurate. And they're underestimating the difficulty of the portage to go, and they're underestimating the number of rapids in the so-called Dead River. They're also, you were in a nice canoe, a nice modern canoe, I'm pretty sure. You were not in a bateau.
Okay, I can confirm.
Right, right. Your experience would have been much more miserable in a bateau, and that's what these guys are in. So why a bateau? A bateau is a heavier boat. You can haul more stuff in it. And if you're moving an army, you've got a lot of weapons, gunpowder, provisions, small cannon that you have to be moving along. Canoes aren't going to do the job. But the problem is this route is one that is marginal for canoes. It's not good enough for bateau because of the rapids and the portages that are involved in it. Other big problem is the bateau they were using were freshly built using green wood. They were doing it in a hurry, so it hadn't been seasoned yet. So these boats are not ready for the duress that they're going to be put under on this. So they start to fall apart on these guys. So they start to lose a lot of their kit and their provisions, so they're starving. And then you're right, it's October, and October up there in the Highlands can bring snow, and it did bring them some snow. So everything that could go wrong did go wrong for Arnold's expedition. The amazing thing is that he gets 600 of his 1,100 men through to Quebec. They toughed it out. Now about 500 turned around and went back to Arnold's dismay. And they took a lot of the equipment and provisions that Arnold's full army needed. So it's a great accomplishment to do it. But it was a mistake to launch it in the first place by that route. The route going Lake Champlain, Richelieu River, St. Lawrence had been used by armies many times before, and it is much better for using these bateaux to move an army and its equipment.
Arnold himself is a fascinating character, and obviously the campaigns and his military capabilities and all that is one part of that story, but the ultimate betrayal and what led to it. I know we all know it happened, and I know maybe there's some general awareness of some of the things that contributed to it ultimately, but could you tell the story briefly of exactly how and why someone who was once viewed as one of the leading edges of fighting the British ultimately betrayed the country?
Well, Benedict Arnold is an extremely ambitious man. And we were talking earlier about the ideas of the revolution motivating people. He doesn't seem all that motivated by any of those principled positions. He's motivated by this is an opportunity for Benedict Arnold to get ahead. So he's very aggressive at self-promotion, with schemes for invasions of Canada. And he rubs a lot of people the wrong way. But he also impresses a lot of people because there are a fair number of officers that don't come close to the kind of initiative that Arnold showed. So he can be at his very best in a combat situation because he's a very clear and quick thinker, and he does not hold back from risking his own life and limbs in these situations, whereas a lot of general officers are more in the back lines. So Arnold develops a reputation as the great fighting general of the Patriots. So he gets a very severe leg wound in his left leg at Quebec, in this attack on Quebec at the very end of December 1775. He will get an even more severe wound in the same leg at the Battle of Saratoga in October of 1777. And he hobbles around. His left leg is an inch shorter than his right leg because it's not set properly. He's in a lot of pain. And he feels like his courage and sacrifice in the battlefield have been insufficiently rewarded, that he was not promoted fast enough, that he was not paid enough, that the expenses that he had advanced for his army had not been compensated for fully. And he just nurtures this sense of grievance. And then when we get into the middle of the war, it's kind of the doldrums of the war. It's that after Saratoga, and we get into 1778, 1779, it's not clear that the Patriots are going to win. It's not clear that the British are going to win. But Arnold becomes a pessimist, and he thinks the Patriot cause is going to go down. So he thinks...
I don't mean to interrupt you, but do you think if he thought it was going to succeed, he would have never...
Yeah, if he thinks it's a slam dunk,
he's just going to stay with the side.
He's going to stay with the winning side because the winning side is going to pay off, right? But he just thought, the Patriot cause looks like it's going to go down. Do I want to go down with that ship when they haven't promoted me the way I wanted to? They haven't given me the money that I wanted. And then he married a young loyalist woman. And she listens to his grievances and says, there's an alternative. You could contact the British who were occupying New York City, and through secret conduits, I can help you set that up. And you can negotiate a good payday from the British. And Arnold's talking about 20,000 pounds sterling, which would be the equivalent of $1 million today or more. This would solve Arnold's money woes. If this helps to be the tipping point that brings down the Patriots, then Arnold's in a strong position to help to lead the loyalist America of the future. So that's the calculation. And it turns out it's a miscalculation. Patriot cause is more resilient than Arnold had recognized. And instead of persuading many more Americans to become loyalists, if anything, it disgusted people who thought, I don't want to be like Arnold. I don't want to be denounced the way Arnold is being denounced by my neighbors. So if anything, it's helpful to the Patriot cause that he engages in this act of treachery.
Fascinating.
So I want to talk about how the fact that the most powerful army in the world lost to a group of ragtag soldiers some of whom didn't even have shoes to wear. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm just fascinated by that fact. They were the most powerful they were the most powerful army in the world, the most powerful empire, and they lost to an army like that. Why did they lose?
Okay, this is big and complicated. So it's certainly the Continental Army is very badly supplied, virtually unpaid, great suffering. But by the middle of the war, they're pretty well trained. They started out the war not well trained. But by the time you get into 1778, thanks largely to the drilling by this German officer, Baron von Steuben, who had come to volunteer to help the Patriots and to help himself, because he wanted to become a general, and he was only going to stay a captain if he had stayed in Prussia, which was a principality or a kingdom within what we now call Germany. So he comes over and he helps Washington to turn these raw recruits into a more professional army. They look terrible, but they are very accomplished at fighting. And that's part of the story.
Was this Valley Forge?
This is at Valley Forge. The Valley Forge winter from 1777 to 1778 is when Steuben is put to work drilling these soldiers.
But it's crazy, even sorry to interrupt, but it's crazy that the rebels were even able to fight for that long, I feel like, at that point, right? Because the British thought it was going to be an easy win.
Yeah.
We're just going to go in and sweep the place out, and boom, it's going to be done. And they were...
They did think that.
Yeah.
And there are a number of reasons why it wasn't. One is the geography. As big as an army as the British send, it's not big enough to control this vast territory. So the British Army was pretty successful at moving wherever it wanted to and could brush aside Patriot resistance. But as soon as they moved, then the Patriots move in behind them and take over what the territory the British had just left. That's an ongoing problem, that the British aren't able to consolidate the places that they'd occupied and turn them into loyalist America. Because as soon as they move on, the Patriots move in and they snuff out whatever loyalists had been left behind there. So that's a big part of the issue. And many British officers say, we can beat the rebels, we can't beat the landscape of America. The other thing is that the Patriots can't really win unless they get a navy. They're not able to build their own navy. They don't have the money for it. But what's the second best navy in the world? It's the French. And what's the third best navy in the world? It's the Spanish. And while the Spanish don't enter into any alliance with the new United States, they do have an alliance with France, and France allies with the United States. So suddenly you've got the number 2 and the number 3 navies in the world willing to take on the British. That happens in 1778. And it's because of that the British have to spread their forces even more thinly around the world, because now every colony they have in the world, including in India, is vulnerable to attack from these other navies. Not the American Navy, but the French and the Spanish Navy. So it becomes a global war. And ultimately, it's the French assistance that will make possible the greatest Patriot victory of the war, which is at Yorktown in 1781. Without a French fleet there to trap the British, without a French army to support Washington, more than 2/3 of the fighting people at Yorktown were French. So they're absolutely important that this ragtag group of American were able to create a fighting force sufficient to keep the British preoccupied long enough to bring the French and the Spanish in, and then to win the war.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's also kind of a testament to the competitive advantage that America has, with an ocean separating it from other countries.
Defending the home turf.
Yes,
a little bit.
Right. Yeah, because the British had to, every 4 to 6 weeks they were probably able to send more soldiers over.
Well, yeah, that's partly true, I would say. But, the Loyalists are on home turf, too. And the Native Americans are mostly British allies. So there are a lot of people who know North America really well who are fighting in the Loyalist British cause. But distance does matter, because if the British can't penetrate into the countryside and control it, where are they going to get their food? And it's true that through much of the war, they have to import their food primarily from Ireland. And that's kind of a rope that they're on. So on the one hand, as long as they control the oceans, they're in reasonably good shape. But when it's being challenged by the French and the Spanish, and then with the assistance of some American privateers, who are private warships that are preying on merchant ships, then that supply route becomes much dodgier for them to maintain.
Sure. I want to talk about sacrifice. Mm-hmm. We're familiar with the sacrifices that the soldiers made to fight the war, but I'm wondering if you could just describe what the sacrifice looked like for everyone else. Like I think about, for example, Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, obviously, and the fact that she had to raise a family and take care of the house. I mean, she had some familial support, but she had to do life basically alone, like without her husband, while her husband, who also made a sacrifice for his country, had to be without his family for for years, like maybe close to a decade, and in unfamiliar territory, abroad, after like never leaving Braintree, Massachusetts for most of his life, basically, the Northeast. So can you describe some of the sacrifices that some of the women made and just ordinary people who weren't soldiers, I guess?
Yes, this war affects everybody. So it's not just something that's being fought in some distant place. This is being fought everywhere. And the home front is essential to the war effort. You can't maintain the army without food. You can't maintain it without some clothing. Where is the clothing coming from? It's largely being made by American women who are producing homespun. Where is the food coming from? It's coming from all these farms throughout the 13 new United States. Who's running those farms when so many men are away, either in the Continental Army or for shorter term service in their state militia? Women have to take this on. Now, we shouldn't, think of most of the women of America as these delicate creatures. They weren't. They're farm wives. They're used to doing a lot of work. Well, they have to do even more work. They're the ones that have to be out there tending the animals, tilling the fields, helping to get them plowed. It's hard physical work. It's also work that requires thinking about keeping accounts, of making decisions about when's the right time to put the crop in, when's the right time to harvest it. So a lot of women are taking over managerial responsibilities of their households for long stretches of time. And then with British and Loyalist forces, and in some cases Native Americans, attacking virtually every part of the 13 colonies/states, at some point, there's a lot of destruction of farms, destructions of communities, theft of livestock. Sometimes the theft is being done by patriot forces that are desperate for food. It's chaotic. And unless you had thousands of women and children who were going to support the patriot cause, the whole thing would have collapsed.
Yeah, I was reading, I just finished reading 1776 by David McCullough, and one of the more disturbing descriptions of the war was the barbarity, I guess, and savage behavior of the Hessian troops, Germans, and the way that they treated women. A lot of really terrible stories of rape, and those kinds of things I feel like get kind of maybe overlooked a little bit in the whole story of the war, because you think of the war, you think of soldiers fighting it, but you don't think of horror, like truly horrific accounts like that. So I just found that to be intriguing and disturbing.
Well, that's a interesting thought for a second, because we so romanticize the American Revolution that usually details like that are not something that any of us are all that eager to talk about. But it was a really big part of the war. It was war, and it was a 1700s war, so it was particularly brutal in a lot of ways.
Well, it is a very brutal war, and we do lose sight of that. And we're often preoccupied with these very nice, neat paintings that often emphasize things like the Declaration of Independence, and they're wearing kind of funny clothes, and we just think this was a very stately revolution. We lose sight of that it's a civil war. Civil wars always become especially brutal because you feel like your neighbor should be on your side and he's not, and he's the worst thing going if he's not on your side. And then you've got British forces, many of whom were recruited from the lower ranks of British society, and they look at these prospering colonists, and they won't just give in, and they work up a real sense of bitterness toward them. This happens in all wars of insurgency, that the more powerful force feels like the weaker force should just surrender and give in, and they don't give in, and so that leads to atrocities. And so we lose sight of the fact that this is a war in which people are suffering, horrific wounds and many casualties and many deaths from sickness in these filthy military camps. There's a lot of misery to go around, right? So I find that this actually heightens the importance of the principles of the revolution, that people are willing to endure all of this to achieve a cause that they see as worth fighting and suffering for. The Loyalists also felt they had a cause that was worth fighting and suffering for. There's, in my view, a kind of a nobility for both sets of people, and the tragedy is that both sets of people are Americans, and they're in this terrible situation in which only one side can win.
I was thinking when Garrick was asking about Abigail Adams, about the adaptations of the revolution that we see in media, and I was thinking of that one because of the sort of now famous HBO adaptation of John Adams, which is obviously quite well received. I have to imagine, as a historian and somebody interested in this subject, that you've seen an awful lot of those adaptations over the years. Are there any that stand out to you as particularly good or accurate? I mean, if you're trying to get a sense of what this time period felt like, you watch Mel Gibson's The Patriot, obviously you get one version
that's
of
very
things.
cheesy.
Very much so. But you watch other adaptations and they might be a little bit more, I think, likely to give you a sense of what it was really like. Do you have any that stand out to you?
Well, I think HBO's John Adams actually does a really good job of showing what a difficult struggle this was, and that there's a fair amount of violence. So the tarring and feathering scene in John is, I think, very effectively done to show this is pretty brutal when you treat somebody who's your neighbor this way.
When I saw that scene, I was like genuinely disturbed. It was like horrific to watch this. Like,
it also brought up the fact that, John Adams was angry at Sam Adams in that scene, if you recall. So it wasn't just this harmonious, everybody agreed type of situation.
That's correct. The Patriot leaders, they fought like cats and dogs over all sorts of things. There was a member of Congress from Virginia who wrote to his friend Thomas Jefferson after Jefferson had left the Continental Congress and said to Jefferson, believe me, our Confederation is not founded on brotherly love. So that congressmen are squabbling over almost everything, and yet they're keeping this war going. And despite the fact that this is a civil war, that it somehow prevails is absolutely remarkable.
You briefly mentioned the Declaration of Independence, and I would actually love to touch on that because, well, first of all, 4th of July is coming up.
Yes.
It is America's 250th anniversary this year. It is our semi-quincentennial, if I'm not mistaken. And I think a lot of people, kind of like what you said, Matt, a lot of people may romanticize the war, but people might also romanticize the Declaration, which in a way, like they should, because of the ideals that are embedded in it. But a lot of people underestimate the risks that came with that declaration. For example, all these men who signed that put their life on the line. They literally put their life on the line because they knew that they were at risk of being hanged by the king's orders, for example. So could you describe that risk? Could you describe why it was such a, why it was just such a big deal for them to sign that? And because it's essentially an act of treason, right?
Yeah. Well, they've been committing other acts of treason, but that's a pretty flamboyant one because we remember the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Those are the most famous words in American history, the most influential words. The great majority of the document is a diatribe against the king. And that's striking because prior to that, most of the rhetoric against the British had focused on Parliament and had tried to recruit the king to be the good guy to overrule. So suddenly they're turning savagely on the king and saying the king is the one that bears all of the blame for this.
Yeah, it was essentially like a list of grievances.
Yeah,
against the king,
it's
correct?
basically in the
Well, it's how the
legal.
colonists had been wronged, right?
It's in the legal form of an indictment. So this is a bill of indictment of the king for being somebody who is betraying and killing his own subjects. So when you do that, you're burning your last bridge. They had been fighting for almost a year and a half at that point against British forces without declaring independence, without making it an attack on the king. The position of the Continental Congress until we get into June of 1776 is we're just fighting to reconcile with them, but to reconcile on terms that are acceptable to us. No more taxes levied by Parliament, withdraw British troops occupying places within our colonies, and withdraw certain acts that were enacted to punish Massachusetts and Boston. Take all that stuff back, and we'll do a do-over. We'll stay in the empire. We'll still have royal governors. We'll still be regulated in our commerce by Parliament. So suddenly they're making a pretty dramatic break, saying we're not fighting for reconciliation anymore. We're fighting for our own country. So one of the great myths of the American Revolution is that the colonists were unhappy being part of the British Empire and were eager to become independent. And they weren't. They were eager to be in a loose relationship with the empire. And when that became impossible, then as a plan B, it's we'll declare independence. And it's in June to July of 1776 that they go to plan B, which is independence. But when you do that, there's no going back. You put your name on this document. Everybody else who continues to fight for this cause now is clearly committing acts of treason against their sovereign king. And the only way they're going to fend that off is by transferring sovereignty in America away from the king and into something they called the people.
Can you talk a little bit about the language of the Declaration too? Because I know that obviously, it went through an initial draft phase and there were changes made to it. You mentioned the importance of religion, in the Revolution earlier in the conversation. And, one of the more famous changes was, I believe, sacred and undeniable to self-evident. And there was a discussion, as far as I understand, about the religiosity of that statement and whatnot. How, in terms of the language construction of that declaration, how much of that was very, very important? Obviously, they considered it very important, but in retrospect, was the choice of the wording and exactly how it was phrased and framed key to the psychology of the war in any way?
It's a very good question. So the actual vote for independence happens on July 2nd. We don't celebrate July 2nd, to the dismay of John Adams, who felt that it was the politics of navigating that through Congress, and July 2nd, which he was very key on. July 4th is when the document, the Declaration of Independence, is adopted by Congress. So basically, this is a public-facing document. It is meant to persuade the people living within the new 13 United States that they should be fighting for independence, not reconciliation anymore. And it's meant for the opinion of leading people in Europe. So it's supposed to help persuade the French, the Spanish, and others that the patriot cause is a worthy one. And so it has to be carefully pitched. There are a lot of careful, as you suggested, careful word choices in there. Jefferson gets the credit, and he is the primary drafter of the first draft. But Congress will, in what's called the Committee of the Whole, meaning every member of Congress would participate in tweaking that language and pulling some stuff out and putting a few more things in. Greatly irritated Jefferson, who thought that he'd nailed it the first time, right?
Yeah, like Ben Franklin famously crossed out sacred rights and replaced it with unalienable.
Yes.
Right.
So that goes to the kind of the Enlightenment tradition, which was not entirely on board with Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Are there any, I know that we're going to wrap soon, but if it's good, I just want to ask you a couple more questions. Are there any founding fathers that you think deserve more credit or recognition? And are there any founding fathers that you identify with maybe more than others?
I think it's probably impossible to give George Washington too much credit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the Ken Burns film really wants to make that point. This will be heresy for coming from the former Thomas Jefferson chair at the University of Virginia. I think in many ways we probably give Jefferson a little more credit than he deserves for it all, which is not to say he deserves no credit.
Right.
Okay, I want to be, all of your listeners that like Thomas Jefferson, I'm not completely ragging on him.
Well, his credit must come from his career after, too. I mean, becoming president and the Louisiana
All of
Purchase.
that helps.
That really does
helps.
glow him up.
But,
And him being a Southerner, maybe? Does that tie into it at all?
Well, he's from Virginia, obviously, but he was a pretty bad wartime governor of Virginia. And he's not a real cheerleader for the U.S. Constitution when it gets adopted, and he has to be reluctantly brought on board by his friend James Madison. So Jefferson's the simplest thing you can say about Jefferson is he's an extremely complicated man with enormous accomplishments, a powerful intellect, some extraordinary inconsistency. Absolutely important in the longer run of history in that period of time. But for the Revolution per se, I would say Washington is the absolutely essential person. Mm-hmm. And that we probably don't give John Adams enough credit. He was probably right about that. People were reluctant to give John Adams credit because he's such a needy guy and he wants all the credit.
I think I have time for maybe one more question. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So obviously America turns 250 this year. And I'm just wondering, as a historian who loves that era and as an American, what does that mean to you and how are you celebrating?
Well, I'm celebrating by appearing on your podcast.
Thank you.
By giving the talk that I gave at the Maine Historical Society last night. I'm doing a variety of things. I will also be doing a presentation in Paris, France, to the French American Studies Association. So it's a very busy year because of the 250th. And I think it's really, I can't think of too many things that are more important than for Americans to reflect on their revolution, to reflect on the sufferings that achieved the revolution, and to think on the core principles of the revolution and what they mean in our lives today, as an ongoing challenge to us to be the very best citizens that we can be.
It's a good thought.
Yeah. Well, sorry. Can I ask one more, please?
Yes.
Did you have something?
Not at all. Go right ahead.
So I'm glad that you brought that up because last night at the event, I asked you the question about the Abigail Adams quote when she said, "Posterity who are to reap the blessings will scarcely be able to conceive the hardships and sufferings of their ancestors." And sometimes I do wonder if, a lot of Americans don't really reflect on the revolution or they don't know that much about it. They don't really comprehend the tremendous, profound sacrifices that went into the birth of this nation. So I'm wondering if you could just maybe briefly reflect on that quote. And
well, it goes into everything we've been talking about here. There was nothing easy or automatic about the American Revolution. It's not all Americans lined up and it was just against the British. It's a civil war. So when you're fighting a civil war on one side and then you're fighting the Atlantic Ocean's most powerful empire at the same time, you got your work cut out for you. And all sorts of things go wrong. The Patriots were not united on all the core issues. There are conflicting ambitions. It's a very human story. And yet out of it has come some of the most inspirational principles that could bind us together as a nation. Mm-hmm. So it's that whole package deal. Let's look at the whole thing, see it in all of its difficulties, see what a tough choice it was that people made if they did support the revolution. It's not an easy choice for any of them. And that they were willing to see it through, and they did see it through. It's a remarkable story.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and we ignore our history much to our peril, in my estimation. So
You will have every historian in the land agree with you.
yes,
No doubt.
Well, Mr. Alan Taylor, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We appreciate your time and can't thank you enough. To wrap
Don't
it
forget
up,
the book.
Yes. So we have Liberty Men and Great Proprietors that by Alan Taylor. What are some other books? What's your most recent book? Where can people find you?
Probably the most relevant book. I wrote a book called American Revolutions. So an S at the end of revolution, and the pitch of the book, it looks at the whole American Revolution on the scale of the whole North American continent, and involves the French and the Spanish and so forth. But there's a tension. Joseph Martin makes another appearance. So that's probably the other book that would be of most interest.
And where can they find where can they find your work?
You could go to any independent bookstore. You could go to Amazon. You can just look under my name and make sure it's a history book, because there are other Alan Taylors in the world. Right?
But you are the most preeminent Alan Taylor. So
In Maine, anyway.
and then people can find you in Ken Burns' recent documentary,
Yes,
The American
they can.
Revolution.
So if people haven't seen that, I encourage them to see it. I think it's a wonderful film.
And you're featured quite prominently, which is really cool. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. It was very nice to be part of that film project.
It's cool to see a Mainer in it too. So
Yes.
proud Mainer.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Garrett.
Happy 250th.
Matt.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.